I'm here with the great writer Pankaj Mishra, who has published really an incredible and thought-provoking um, and challenging new book. So thank you so much for chatting, Pankaj. Um,
Thank you,
I
Alan.
wanted to start with something that is in the news that I think your book maybe could shed some light on, which is Donald Trump's recently announced plan to turn Gaza into the Riviera, a plan of ethnic cleansing that was masked as a sort of Atlantic City in the Middle East thing, and which a lot of the dynamics you write about in the book, how the Western press treated it and didn't treat it, what was ridiculed about it, but not necessarily fleshed out in terms of the ethnic cleansing at the heart of his crazy idea. A lot of those dynamics that you really unpack in depth in the book seem to be at play even in this moment over the last week. Can you talk about um, the Gaza Riviera idea, and then how some of these dynamics that you've been tracking in terms of the press, in terms of the public, in terms of how memory is used and abused, how you saw them play out in recent days?
Anand, I'm actually quite surprised by just how surprised, so many people are, and I'm speaking here mostly of mainstream politicians in Europe and the United States, of course, expressing shock and horror at this plan of Donald Trump's. And of course, journalists presenting this as, a sort of both as a monstrosity and yet at the same time, normalizing it by talking about, how there might be certain problems such as Hamas in the way of Donald Trump. Um, I think it raises a question. Is ethnic cleansing much worse than genocide? The destruction of Gaza, which in a way sets the stage for these fantasies of, creating a Riviera there, was that not already the most monstrous thing that can happen to people in Gaza? Did we pay enough attention to this? The people today saying, okay, you didn't vote for Biden, this is what you get. Did these people, when the mass extermination of Gaza was going on, did they raise their voice in sympathy for Palestinians? There are all kinds of questions that are thrown up by this, announcement by Trump. Of course, he's an incredibly um, vulgar man. There's no question, so this whole idea reeks of a certain kind of vulgarity and obscenity, creating Rivera in a place that has seen mass death, mass extermination, mass bereavement. But at the same time, I think, the reactions to Trump speak of a certain kind of self-deception, if I'm not mistaken. They speak of a certain kind of selective memory, selective attention. And that's really the most striking thing about, the last few days, how we've actually forgotten how we got to this phase. The fact that Biden himself was promoting a mode of ethnic cleansing by asking the Egyptian president to take in Palestinians, by sending his Secretary of State to various Gulf capitals with this plan of resettlement. That this is something that has been in the making for some time, that the Israeli establishment too has been preparing for this. So this is certainly not something unprecedented or unexpected.
The book is called The World After Gaza, and I love that. It's not just after Gaza, but it's the world after Gaza. And there's an argument you make throughout, but at the beginning, I think you say, watching something like what happened in Gaza with indifference and helplessness changes us all. So it obviously the worst impact it has is on the people in that place, but that we are all irrevocably changed by an event like that. And you start the book that way. Talk about that idea and why you think there's so many conflicts in the world. There have been so many conflicts in the world. This one will have this power to kind of alter the world as a whole and to shatter some very powerful illusions.
I think, I mean, very obviously, this is the first time that hundreds of millions of people, I would dare say billions of people around the world, have been exposed to a live streamed atrocity, that was not confined to 1 day or 2 days, but went on for 15 months, is still continuing as we speak. And again, with digital technology making available instantly these scenes of extreme violence, and a lot of people who have never ever really seen such things, the kind of things we saw in the last 15 months, parents holding headless corpses of their children, a young man, being burnt alive on video, um, completely unimaginable scenes of horror, which were available, extremely widely available on phones everywhere. So I think, in many ways, our souls and minds have never been bombarded with such extreme images. So it's a very obvious thing to say that the way we experience the world is going to be fundamentally altered, and I think psychoanalysts and psychotherapists, and indeed, intellectual historians or emotional historians over the decades to come will keep registering this enormous impact on our psyches, quite apart from all the political consequences flowing from this, and the loss of legitimacy and credibility of Western powers who have supported and enabled this. I think the sheer sort of psychic burden that people who saw this, both middle-aged, old, and young people, will have to carry for the rest of their lives. I think we are, profoundly underestimating the shock it has delivered to our inner lives.
You write, this is a phrase I love. You write that a whole generation of young people in the West were pushed into moral adulthood by this war. What did you mean by moral adulthood, and describe that dynamic?
Well, I think, perhaps actually that's not the correct expression to use, because I think, the students have demonstrated a very sort of, student protesters and anyone actually who protested against these atrocities, a very clear sense of right and wrong, just sort of simply insisting that whatever, reason you might have to attack a place like Gaza and to go after Hamas there, uh, the deaths of so many children, of so many, uninvolved sort of civilians, is simply not justifiable and simply not acceptable. And that this kind of civilian toll and this level of destruction is simply not acceptable. And I think, they, more than politicians and mainstream journalists, demonstrated a very basic level of morality, a basic sort of ordinary decency. And I think that was most striking in the case of young protesters, who, I think the reason is that they are not part of the professional world right now. They're not sort of, caught up in a professional environment where they have to make certain moral compromises in order to protect their jobs, in order to protect their careers. They don't have jobs or careers yet, so they could express their outrage much more fluently and boldly than the rest of us. But I think, to be a young person right now, I have a daughter who's a teenager, and this is, obviously a relatively innocent time where you don't think about these things. You don't really think about the bleak aspects of the world. But here you are being exposed to these atrocities day in and day out, completely baffled, wondering why your elders are all right with this. And that's really what I mean, like, being sort of coerced into a world where you have to take responsibility, you have to take moral responsibility because your elders are refusing to do that. So you go out and demonstrate because your elders are deeply, severely, morally compromised.